You are welcome to yet another episode of LFN What's Your Say? The leading listening show where we discuss important issues with important people like you. We are still featuring R. Kelly. Real name Robert Sylvester Kelly. Also known as the R&B King. The Mann Act charges against Robert Sylvester Kelly, stemming from his alleged transportation of Faith Rogers across state lines in May 2017 and February 2018 hinge on the prosecution's claim that he knowingly transported her from Texas to New York with the intent to engage in illegal sexual activity, specifically sexual activity rendered unlawful by his said failure to disclose a herpes diagnosis, violating New York public health law. The defense argues that the prosecution failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Kelly possessed the requisite intent at the time of transportation to engage in illegal sexual activity. By focusing on the lack of direct evidence of intent, the speculative nature of the prosecution's reliance on inferred intent and the possibility that Mr. Kelly intended to disclose his health status but later failed to do so. This argument seeks dismissal of the Mann Act charges related to Ms. Rogers. The Mann Act criminalizes knowingly transporting any individual in interstate or foreign commerce with intent that such individual engage in prostitution, or in any sexual activity for which any person can be charged with a criminal offense. To secure a conviction, the prosecution were obligated to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Kelly knowingly transported Faith Rogers across state lines, and that he did so with the intent to engage in sexual activity that is illegal under federal, state or local law, and that the sexual activity was in fact illegal. In this case, the alleged illegality stems from New York public health law, which makes it a misdemeanor to knowingly engage in sexual activity without disclosing a communicable disease such as herpes, thereby negating informed consent. The beyond a reasonable doubt standard is the highest in American jurisprudence, requiring the jury to be convinced that no reasonable alternative explanation exists for the defendant's actions. In this matter, the critical element, which is intent, must be proven at the time of transportation and not at the time of the sexual activity itself. Circumstantial evidence may support an inference of intent, but such inferences must be grounded in facts that exclude reasonable doubt. This defense contends that the prosecution's evidence falls short of this rigorous standard, particularly regarding R. Kelly's intent at the time he arranged Ms. Rogers' travel. The prosecution's Mann Act charges rely heavily on the assertion that R. Kelly transported Faith from Texas to New York in May 2017 and February 2018 with the intent to engage in sexual activity without disclosing his herpes diagnosis, thereby rendering the activity illegal under New York law. However, the prosecution failed to present direct evidence of his intent at the time of transportation, relying instead on speculative inferences drawn from circumstantial evidence. This approach does not meet the beyond a reasonable doubt standard. Intent is a mental state and direct evidence such as explicit statements or admissions is rare. However, the prosecution presented no communications, documents or witness testimony directly indicating that Mr. Kelly planned at the time of arranging her travel to engage in sexual activity without disclosing his herpes diagnosis. Faith Rogers' testimony while describing the events of their encounters in New York focused on R. Kelly's actions after her arrival, not his state of mind when arranging her travel. For example, she testified that R. Kelly did not disclose his herpes diagnosis during their sexual encounters, but she provided no evidence showing that he formed this intent before or during the arrangement of her interstate travel. This could have transpired in a refusal to a health check proposal which, as an adult woman, Faith was expected to request. Only if Faith had made such a request and R. Kelly refused would it be logical to conclude that he in fact had no intention to disclose his health status at the time of transportation. The absence of such evidence is very significant because the Mann Act requires that the illicit intent exist at the time of transportation. Without such evidence, the prosecution's case rests on inferences that are insufficient to exclude reasonable doubt. And these are inferences made in a criminal case to transform what were simple misdemeanors in New York payable with a fine into a federal felony under the Mann Act. A reasonable alternative explanation exists that undermines the prosecution's claim. Mr. Kelly may have intended to disclose his herpes diagnosis when arranging Faith Rogers' travel but later failed to do so, perhaps due to hesitation, embarrassment or a spontaneous decision when she finally arrived. This scenario raised in prior discussions is plausible given the personal and sensitive nature of disclosing a medical condition. And this should be conceivable considering the stigma attached to STDs. Certainly not many people would be comfortable disclosing such a health condition on communication devices with stored logs. If R. Kelly intended to disclose at the time of transportation, his subsequent failure to do so does not satisfy the Mann Act's requirement of illicit intent at the time of the transportation. The prosecution presented no evidence to disprove this alternative possibility. For example, there were no text messages, emails, or witness statements showing that R. Kelly explicitly planned to withhold his diagnosis when inviting her to New York. Without evidence negating the possibility that he intended to disclose, the jury cannot conclude beyond a reasonable doubt that his intent was illicit at the time of transportation. In fact, in the United States v. Jackson case, a Mann Act conviction where evidence of intent was speculative was reversed, and so should R. Kelly's. The prosecution relied heavily on circumstantial evidence which was not even derived from Faith Rogers' testimony. To infer that R. Kelly intended to engage in illegal sexual activity when he arranged her travel is far-fetched. While circumstantial evidence may in some cases be permissible, it must be sufficiently robust to exclude reasonable alternative explanations, and it wasn't. The prosecution's inferences are speculative and fail to meet the required standard. Faith Rogers testified that R. Kelly arranged her travel and engaged in sexual activity without disclosing his herpes diagnosis, resulting in her contracting the disease. However, her testimony focuses on the events in New York and not Kelly's intent at the time of transportation. The prosecution did not present any evidence, such as communications or planning documents, showing that R. Kelly's purpose in arranging her travel was to engage in sexual activity without any health checks, which is the usual procedure by two adults of sound mind. The jury could not reasonably infer intent from the outcome. The prosecution introduced testimony from R. Kelly's physician that he had been prescribed herpes medication since 2007, proving his awareness of his diagnosis. While this establishes that R. Kelly knew he had herpes, it does not prove that he intended to withhold this information when arranging Faith Rogers' travel. Awareness of a condition is distinct from intent to conceal it during transportation. The medical evidence supports the New York public health law violation, a separate predicate act in the public health misdemeanor, but does not directly address Mr. Kelly's intent under the Mann Act. The prosecution also argued that Mr. Kelly's alleged pattern of nondisclosure with other accusers supports an inference that he intended to withhold his diagnosis from Faith Rogers at the time of transportation. However, this inference is flawed. A pattern of behavior may suggest a propensity to act in a certain way, but it does not conclusively prove intent in a specific instance, especially when the standard is beyond a reasonable doubt. In fact, the United States v. Bell case cautions against over-reliance on propensity evidence to prove intent. The testimony of other accusers relates to separate incidents, not the specific transportation of Ms. Rogers in May 2017 or February 2018. Without direct evidence linking Mr. Kelly's prior conduct to his intent in this case, the inference is speculative and insufficient. In fact, the prosecution's reliance on a pattern of behavior also ignores the possibility that R. Kelly's intent may have varied across instances. For example, he may have intended to disclose his diagnosis to Ms. Rogers at transportation but failed to do so due to personal discomfort, or a change in circumstances on arrival. The absence of evidence disproving this alternative explanation creates reasonable doubt about his intent at the time of transportation. The prosecution therefore failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that R. Kelly violated the Mann Act by transporting Faith Rogers across state lines in May 2017 and February 2018 with the alleged intent to engage in illegal sexual activity. The absence of direct evidence of Mr. Kelly's intent at the time of transportation, combined with the plausible alternative explanation that he intended to disclose his herpes diagnosis but later failed to do so, creates reasonable doubt. The Mann Act requires proof of illicit intent at the time of transportation, and the prosecution's speculative inferences do not meet the rigorous beyond a reasonable doubt standard given the alternative possibility. This defense therefore respectfully requests that the Mann Act charges related to Faith Rogers be dismissed with immediate effect. Thank you for watching today's video, a production of LFN Media. giving you another perspective of issues at hand. We make it our business to keep you updated with the truth amidst the cloud of lies the media wants you to believe. It is therefore important to subscribe to this channel, hit the bell icon and allow all notifications so that you don't miss out whenever we publish a new video.